Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. I hope all of you are doing absolutely fine. Just a reminder once again, the PDF of this video would be available for your download in the description of the video. Click on the link and you can get the PDF just like yesterday. Let's begin today's session with the first article that we have that talks about the problems in the prison system in India, specifically focusing on the problems in the Bastar district. The author here is a human rights lawyer and thus is very closely connected to the people who have had to suffer in the jails in the Bastar region because a lot of them were arrested after some Naxalite attack or the other. The author here says that in the Bastar region specifically, even during the COVID times, the problem of militarization has not stopped. Even during the pandemic, the Naxals have kept on continuing their activities of attacking the security forces, and the security forces also, as expected, have retaliated. However, the issue is that people who don't really live in that area, people like you, people like me, we don't really follow the news after the headline gets away from the newspaper. But the author says the reality is that after every Naxal attack, the police or the local administration comes into that region and the locals are arrested in large numbers. Even when the locals might not have played any role in that attack, but still they are arrested because the administration has to show at the top that we are taking some actions. That is why after every Naxal attack, you will see a lot of people being sent to the prison, and then there is a case that goes on for many months and years against those people who are mainly tribals and have no way to afford a good lawyer for themselves. That is why the problems of arrest of the local Adivasis in many fabricated cases continues even today. Now, the problem is that once a person is sent to jail on such serious offenses, the acts that are used against the person includes UAPA, and other very stringent acts which make sure that getting a bail under this particular provision is next to impossible. In that particular respect, the only ray of hope for the person arrested is that the person would get justice. But the problem is that the justice now depends on the efficiency of the judicial system and the good governance of jails. And in case of India and specifically in the Bastar region, both of these are missing. The people who are living in the conflict zone, for them, jail conditions and speedy trials are a matter of life and death. There are two big problems here. The common perception in minds of the people is that once a person is sent to the jail, they don't matter to the society. That is why in India, you will never have a debate about the bad condition in the jail or whether or not the people in the jail are getting their rights or not. Because for us, once a person is sent to jail, we assume that the person does not even have any right to live in the society. That is why no one really pays attention to the condition of the prisons across the country. Secondly, as we discussed earlier, when any untoward incident happens in the Naxal region, it makes the news headlines for 1 week or 10 days or 2 weeks, but after that, all of it is forgotten. But that is not true about the people who are living in that area. Even if they are not involved in Naxal activities, they are always seen with suspicion by the state agencies. After such indiscriminate arrests take place, lawyers such as this author get calls from the relatives to come with them to the magistrate and hopefully give justice to them. The author thus has a very humanitarian point of view towards these people and is writing an article about the hardships that these people are facing. Now, the problem that the author is pointing out here is that the jail system anyways was very inefficient and it has become even worse during the COVID pandemic. For instance, for about a month and a half, the authorities did not even allow any jail visits. Usually, the family members of the people in the jail are allowed to visit during the first half of the day. But during this period, without giving any reason, the jail authorities did not let anyone meet the prisoners. Now, for the people living in the prison, the only way that they can be in touch with the family, they can be in touch with the society is during these jail visits, which were not allowed. In Bastar specifically, there are about 3,500 people in the prison, and only a very few of them are convicts while other are under trials. Now, understand this difference. Whenever you see in a movie people, whenever they are shown in a prison, you would see that there are two types of people. One who are wearing their colored dresses, that or their home clothes, the clothes that they have brought from their house. The rest of the people would be wearing the jail uniform, mostly white and black. This is the easiest way to identify who is a convict and who is an under trial. The difference is, convict is a person against whom the decision of the court has been given and he or she is serving the time. Under trial are those people against whom the case is still going on, but they are just arrested because bail has not been given to them. So whenever the court hears a matter, the under trials have to go to the court and they would have to be present when the judge hears their matter. Now the harsh reality in India is that a majority of people who are in the jail in India right now are not convicts, they are under trials. Means those people against whom the court hasn't even given the final decision. Not just this, the deplorable condition of the jail system can be understood by the fact that there are a lot of under trials in the jail that have served more time than what is the maximum punishment. For instance, let's say someone has committed a crime for which the maximum punishment can only be 7 years if proven guilty. But the case is still going on in the court and they are in the prison as an under trial. Their case may go on for 10, 12 years and the decision would not be given and they would still be in the jail. Just imagine, if decision would have been given, they would have only had to spend 7 years in jail. But they have already spent 10, 12 years in jail because the decision has not been given. That is a true condition of many under trials in India right now. In fact, I would like you all to read about a very important case of the Supreme Court called the Hossainara Khatoon versus the state of Bihar case. This 1979 case is one of the first examples of PIL in India, and the case was specifically for this reason only. The PIL was filed by an advocate on the basis that thousands of people under trial are in the prison and their case is just not being heard by the court. This led to about 40,000 people being released from the jails in Bihar. This is the situation in many parts of the country even today. The author here says that many people in the Bastar region who are arrested under the Naxal charges, against them, the case usually goes on in the special NIA court. NIA is a national investigation agency that mainly investigates cases related to terror in India. First special NIA court was set up in Bastar in May 2015, with the second one being set up in 2021. So there is still a lack of such courts which can hear cases. In 2021, the government decided that the NIA courts should be decentralized and thus a lot of files had to be shifted from one court to the other. Usually at the district court level or at the lower judiciary level, we still have most of the records being kept in the form of file and paper, and that is why transfer of all those records is a very tedious process. The prisons in India anyways are overcrowded with the number of people in the prison much more than the capacity. Originally, we used to see that each case is heard usually only once in a month. And even then, if one of the people or the witnesses is not present, the judge usually gives a second date, which is usually in the next month. The worst part is that the witnesses against these people are no one but the investigating officers themselves and people who are working for the police and for the security forces who want to show to the authorities that we have caught some people. That is why in many cases, the witnesses also are not really credible. We discussed earlier also how under UAPA getting a bail is extremely rare, and that is why a lot of families of these under trial people look for any possible way in which they can get their loved ones out. And this gives a chance to the lawyers to dupe them of a lot of money. There are many lawyers who make false promises to the families and say, if you give me money, I will try to get this person out on bail. Now the lawyers then pass on the money to the clerks and even to judges in some parts, which leads to corruption of the entire system of judiciary that we have. Now, there are a lot of points in this article that need pondering. For instance, the lack of courts, the overcrowding of the prisons, the plight of the under trials, etc. But for now, let us focus on the condition of people who are living in the prisons in India right now. If you need to know about the prisons in India, the most credible source is the Prison Statistics of India 2020 report. This report contains a lot of details about the condition of prisons in India. As per the report, between December 2019 and December 2020, the prison occupancy reduced from 120 to 118%. Now just try and understand this. The prison capacity anyways is overflowing. So a prison that has room for 100 people has 118 people locked up. So you can see the condition of prisons in India. At the time of pandemic, when people were asked to maintain social distancing, in prisons we had people who were living or sharing rooms when they were not even allowed to do that. During pandemic, we saw 9 lakh more arrests as compared to 2019. Not just this, the most depressing feature of this report is that in December 2020, 76% people in the prisons in India were under trials. Means only 24% people were those against whom the decision was already given, while 3/4 are the ones against whom decision has not even been given. If you look at the state-wise scenario, you would see in 17 states, the prison population rose by 23% as opposed to 2 to 4% increase in the previous years. Mainly states such as UP, Sikkim and Uttarakhand are the ones where the occupancy rate is the highest. For instance, in UP, the prisons are occupied at 177%. So when there is space for 100 people, 177 people are locked up in the prison. Only states such as Kerala, Punjab, Haryana, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Mizoram could reduce the number of occupancy in their prisons to below 100%. Not just this, during the COVID times, since the courts were not having their hearings physically, there were video conferences that were going on, and thus in every prison there was a requirement to have video conferencing facility. However, only 69% of the prisons in India have video conferencing facility as per this report. The number has increased as compared to 2019. However, in certain states, the facility was extremely low, such as Tamil Nadu, Manipur, West Bengal, Nagaland, Andaman, Nicobar, etc. The facility in the jails of having video conferencing was less than 50%. It is only the Uttarakhand state that has video facility in all their jails, despite having a high occupancy rate of 169%. Apart from that, the prison report also says that the availability of medical staff in the jail is extremely low. There's a huge shortage of medical staff across the country that is seen. Some glaring examples can be seen in case of Goa and Karnataka. In Goa, there are only 2 medical staff for 500 inmates. In Karnataka, only 26 medical staff for over 14,000 prisoners, and with a vacancy of 90%, Uttarakhand has only 1 medical officer for close to 6,000 inmates. Just imagine the situation that the prisoners are facing in these states. The only states that have met the benchmark of 1 medical officer for 300 prisoners are Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya. Now, another interesting point here is that there was a committee set up by the Supreme Court to recommend about how to improve the condition of the prisons in India and specifically how to avoid overcrowding. This committee was Justice Amitav Roy Committee. They suggested that number 1, speedy trials have to be the way forward. Second, there has to be at least 1 lawyer for every 30 prisoners, if not more. Third, there should be special fast-track courts, especially for petty offences which have been pending for over 5 years. And last, we should also give a push to the concept of plea bargaining. Plea bargaining means if a person is ready to accept his or her crime without the need to go to court, without the need for the court to spend a lot of time, that person should be offered a lower punishment to encourage people to accept their crimes in case of petty offences. The next article that we have focuses on the IPCC's latest report about the problems of climate change that we are facing not just in India but across the world. Now, IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as you know, is one of those agencies that publish climate change related reports continuously and are seen as one of the most credible sources of information in this particular field. As per the latest report, the IPCC says that the world faces unavoidable climate hazards over the next 2 decades, with at least a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius in global temperature, which is seen as imminent. Now, all the data that is given here in this article is very scary, but unfortunately, it is nothing that we have not heard till now. We keep on hearing about the problems of climate change, global warming every second, third day. None of these articles are positive. All these articles point towards the same thing, that the countries around the world, including India, are just not doing enough. So there's no reason to be surprised by this article, but just a refresher and 1 or 2 new facts have been given here. The article here says that the targets that the nations have set for themselves at the Glasgow summit are too far in the future. For example, India's target of achieving net zero emission is a very, very far target, and what we need are immediate cut in the emissions, which the nations across the world are just not doing. Even if all the targets are fulfilled by the countries, which will never happen, we will still not remain below the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. The new thing that the report mentions here, which is relevant for you, is something called the wet bulb temperature. The report says that the wet bulb temperature, especially in South Asia, is an index of impact of heat and humidity combined on the human health. The article says that Lucknow and Patna specifically are amongst the cities which will reach this wet bulb temperature of an average of 35 degrees Celsius if the emissions continue to rise. The other cities in India which are under the danger of reaching this situation are Bhubaneswar, Chennai, Mumbai, Indore, and Ahmedabad, which will reach their wet bulb temperature of 32 to 34 degrees Celsius if the emissions continue to rise. Even if the nations across the world do meet their current climate change pledges, that will still lead to a rise in the sea levels of about 44 to 76 centimeter. And if the emissions are higher, then we can see the sea levels rise by as much as 2 meters this century and 5 meters by 2150, which means that a lot of nations across the world would not be habitable anymore. India remains one of the most vulnerable nations across the world, and by 2050, as many as 3.5 crore Indians could face the issue of annual coastal flooding, since India has a really long coastline. Now, the IPCC report which is mentioned here is given on the IPCC website, from where I have taken a couple of screenshots for you to understand the issue and the impact of climate change on various ecosystems. Do spend some time on this table and try and understand the impact of climate change, as will be seen in many other ecosystems across the world. This screenshot, as I said, has been taken from the original IPCC report only. This table, for example, tells you that in areas of Africa, Asia, the ecosystems that will have the most damage would be the terrestrial ecosystems. On the other hand, if you consider what will be the change in the range of the species that are living in different areas, that is terrestrial, freshwater, and ocean, in Asia, you can see that the species living in the terrestrial region would not really have a lot of impact, but the species living in Africa would have a considerable impact due to climate change. The same can be seen for different regions across the world. The other table that I have taken from here is the report mentions specifically region by region what are the main risks that are associated with climate change. For Asia, for instance, the report says that urban infrastructure damage and impact on human well-being and health will be seen due to flooding, especially in the coastal cities, etc. The report also says that there will be more frequent, extensive coral bleaching and subsequent coral mortality induced by ocean warming and acidification. These are the risks, especially with respect to Asia, due to the climate change that we are seeing across the world. Now, the IPCC, as you would know by now, it is an international body that was set up in 1988 by two organizations coming together. These two were the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. The objective was that the policymakers wanted a regular assessment of the scientific basis of climate change, its impact, the future risk, etc., so that the policies can be framed in that regard. Do understand, the IPCC does not do any kind of research. What they do is they take up reports from multiple organizations and then they prepare a final report by interpreting that data. So IPCC is not really a research organization, it's more of an organization that collects data, looks into that research, and then give their conclusions so that the policymakers can take their decisions in a much more holistic manner. Every few months, they prepare an assessment report. The data that we have taken is from Assessment Report 6. Remember, Assessment Report 6 also has multiple parts. One part of Assessment Report 6 was published a few months back. The other part from where we have taken the data was just released in the month of Feb. And as per their website, there will be more parts of report number 6 coming down. The assessment report is published by 3 groups of working scientists. First group that deals with the scientific basis for climate change. The second group that deals with the likely impact of the climate change. And the third group that deals with what actions can be taken to combat the climate change issue around the world. The next article that we have focuses on the big news of major oil companies around the world announcing their exit from Russia. It focuses mainly on 2 companies, that is, the British energy sector's biggest oil company, that is Shell, announced that they will exit Russia. Now, the British company Shell actually works in Russia in a joint venture with a Russian energy company called Gazprom, which is owned by the government of Russia only. These two have a joint venture in which they extract the liquefied natural gas from Sakhalin-2 gas project, apart from exploring new energy fields in Siberia. This announcement came after one of the other major British companies, that is British Petroleum, announcing that they will also exit from Russia and end their joint venture with Rosneft. Rosneft also, just like Gazprom, is a major gas company in Russia that is owned by the Russian government. So much so that all their profits are transferred to the Russian governments. And it is said that because of these huge profits, the Russian government is able to sponsor the wars and buy the weapons which are responsible for attacking nations such as Ukraine. Now, there are many reasons behind why these companies have decided to finally exit from Russia, despite a lot of pressure from their governments since 2014 when Crimea was annexed by Russia. Ever since Russia has attacked Ukraine, a lot of Western nations have imposed sanctions on Russia, which have resulted in cutting off of a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT network. SWIFT network, as you know, is a network of international banks that helps in multi-currency transactions from banks of one country to the other. Now, a lot of Russian banks would not be a part of the SWIFT, and that is why there might be a problem for the companies that are doing their business in Russia to convert their currency or profit to some other currency. Also, the dollar assets of the Russian central banks have also been frozen, and that is why the companies from the Western nations are now having second thoughts about doing business in Russia. Now, we have discussed earlier also, Russia mainly earns from two sectors. One, defense, and second, the energy sector. So much so that Russia's energy sector contributed more than one third of Russian government's budget last year. And these two companies had a major role to play in that. Shell company that has announced its exit now has assets worth $3 billion in Russia, and the British Petroleum also has major assets in Russia. In fact, these two companies used to have a lot of profit from their operation in Russia, and it still remains to be seen how they cope up with the losses. Because obviously, when they are announcing that they are going back from Russia, it will lead to a lot of loss, especially because the Russian government might also seize their assets in the country and might not allow them to sell their assets. Now, you need to understand this. There have been pressure on these companies of Britain and US, etc., to come out of Russia since 2014. The reason why they were not doing this is because doing business in Russia for them was highly profitable. Although it did damage their image and reputation that they are working in a country that is not really giving a lot of liberty to its people, that is attacking the other nations. But still, these companies had always thought that the damage to their reputation is not as much as the damage to their accounts would be. But finally, now when Russia has done the unthinkable and taken the world on the brink of the Third World War, these organizations have decided to pull the plug finally, even though it would most certainly result in a lot of losses for these companies. Now, the impact on Russia specifically will not be immediate, but will only be long term. These foreign companies that collaborate with the Russian organizations, they offer important technical knowledge about how to extract the most of the natural gas at the best possible cost. These companies also used to bring a lot of investment into the energy sector of Russia, which will be a long-term impact that Russia will see. Not just this, there were trading houses such as Trafigura and Glencore that helped Russia to sell its natural gas and other energy products in Europe. These will also most probably withdraw from Russia, which will lead to further restrictions on the Russian energy sector. It will not just impact Russia, but also the entire world. Since if the Russian supply of natural gas decreases in the world, it will lead to a problem in supply chain and the prices of gas and oil will increase in the near future. The other question is, why did Vladimir Putin take such a drastic step when he knew that his energy sector would come under sanctions? The reason was that he was playing a gamble that the entire European continent is heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil. So if Europe or US put sanctions on Russia, they also would have to suffer economically. So it is not just Russia or the Russian companies that would suffer. Europe also would now have to see from where can it import more gas and at what prices, because Russian gas was the cheapest source of energy that European nations were getting. Russia supplies 40% of Europe's gas needs right now, and at a price that energy prices are just increasing, it will greatly impact the bill of European nations for importing the natural gas. So putting these sanctions on Russia is not a win-win, but is actually a lose-lose situation for both the sides right now. Now, just to give you an insight about how much are the European nations actually dependent on Russia for their natural gas, I have a graph for you which has the latest data about how much natural gas is imported from Russia to these European nations. Smaller Eastern European nations such as North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Moldova, Finland are almost 100% dependent on Russia for the supply of their natural gas. Then we have nations such as Germany, which played a very crucial role in deciding whether or not sanction would be put on Russia. As you can see, 49% of natural gas supply to Germany comes from Russia, 46 for Italy, 40 for Poland, 24 for France, etc. That is why for these nations also to decide not to import natural gas from Russia, they would also have to take a lot of efforts and see how their supply of natural gas can be fulfilled by other nations across the world. Recently, the German Chancellor visited the US a few months back, and the US President at the same time had invited the leader of Qatar. And there were news stories that maybe the US is trying to mediate a deal under which Qatar would supply gas to Germany, but that detail has not been made public, so we'll have to see in the future whether this happens or not. Now, the other question that you might ask is why is it that all of a sudden Europe has become so dependent on Russia for natural gas? There are some very important reasons for that. One reason is the depletion of natural gas resources in the North Sea. So in 1960s and 70s, Europe had good supply of natural gas because they were extracting it from the North Sea. However, it did not really have the kind of reserves that are seen in nations such as Qatar or in Russia. That is why once these resources from the North Sea depleted, natural gas could not be extracted from there. Not just this, Netherlands also used to be an important country from where natural gas could be extracted. However, the Netherlands decided to shut down their Groningen gas fields because of the fear of earthquakes. Since then, Europe has not had any prominent source of natural gas within their own continent, and that is why they had to be in touch with Russia for supplying of natural gas. Not just this, as the developed nations have promised, Europe wants to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and cut down their emissions by 55% by 2030. That makes them all the more dependent on natural gas as a renewable source of energy. Currently, about 20% of Europe's electricity comes from coal production, and they want to reduce it even further. The reason why Germany specifically was not able to take a very strict stand against Russia was because Germany's dependence on Russia is considered to be much higher as compared to other Western European nations. That was because in 2011, Germany passed the Atomic Energy Act, under which they decided that we will cut down all our nuclear energy power plants because of the Fukushima incident in Japan in 2011, which saw many people losing their lives in Japan. In Europe now, 13% of its energy only comes from nuclear power, while 25% comes from natural gas. This requires a constant supply of natural gas at competitive prices. Today, if you look at the import of natural gas in EU, you would see that the cheapest ones comes from Russia, with about 41% of the import of natural gas coming in from Russia. Then there are nations such as Norway and Algeria, which also supply natural gas to Europe, but not as much as Russia does. The push for renewable energy within Europe has made it much more dependent on the Russian natural gas as compared to the others since 2010 specifically. And that is why these sanctions are like a double-edged sword that will not just harm Russia but also the European nations. The next article here talks about the history of Kuki insurgency in the state of Manipur that is undergoing assembly elections as we speak today. The reason why this is in the news is a few days back, most of the insurgent groups associated with the Kuki tribe in Manipur announced that they will collectively vote for the BJP. This comes a few days after the Union Home Minister Shri Amit Shah announced that if BJP comes to power once again in the state of Manipur, they will resolve the Kuki insurgency problem in the next 5 years. So this gives us a chance and a need to study what the Kuki insurgency, what exactly is the insurgency problem in Manipur, its history and its present status. Now, Kukis are not one specific tribe. They're actually an ethnic group which are a group of multiple tribes which live in the northeast part of India, not just in Manipur, but also in states such as Mizoram, Assam, and in some parts of Myanmar as well. Within Manipur, the Kuki tribes are in a minority, while the Meiteis are in majority. So the Kukis live in the hilly areas mainly and make up 30% of the population of the state, while the Meiteis are non-tribals and they live in the valley region. So the first problem within the state is kind of a conflict between the Kuki tribals and the Meitei non-tribals. The Kuki tribals are the ones who live in the hills and they comprise about 30% of the state's population, while majority of the state population is Metis and they live in the valley region. Now, in a democracy, population plays a big role because Metis are the ones who have highest population in the state. They are the ones who usually win most of the seats in the Manipur assembly elections. They are the ones who have most of the seats allotted to them, and the Kukis obviously don't like it. The Kukis want that the number of seats given to them should be more, and they should have a say in how the states would run. The other issue in the state is between the Kuki tribals and the Nagas also. So amongst the tribal population also, there is an issue of Kukis versus the Nagas, since both of them want the controlling position in the state. Now, as I said, the Manipur Assembly has 60 seats, out of which majority of them, that is 40, are held by the Metis and 20 are held by tribals, that is Kukis and the Nagas combined. The Kuki insurgent groups have been active since the 1960s, but recently, since the beginning of the 21st century, they have tried to sign multiple agreements with the governments and achieve a peace settlement. The first one was signed in 2005. It was called the suspension of operation. So in 2005, the Kuki insurgents signed an agreement with the Indian Army saying that now they will not attack the Indian Army contingent and try to have a deal with the government. In 2008, there was a tripartite agreement signed with three parties. First, the Kuki insurgents. Second, the state government of Manipur. And third, the central government under Dr. Manmohan Singh. This agreement also said that the government would try and resolve the Kuki insurgency issue. Until then, they should suspend their operations. But the problem is, as per the Kukis, nothing came out of this agreement, and every few years the government just keeps on extending the agreement. In fact, in the last 5 years also, when Manipur state was ruled by the BJP government, they kept on just extending the agreement without actually giving any permanent solution to the Kuki insurgency issue. Now, like most other insurgency issues in Northeast, the Kuki insurgency issue also started when they demanded a separate state for them called the Kuki land. The problem with demanding such a state is that they wanted regions from Myanmar, Manipur, Assam and Mizoram, which was almost next to impossible. How can you ask some other nation to give a part of it to India because the tribals are demanding it? The second reason behind this conflict is, as I said earlier, the conflict between the Kukis and the Nagas and the struggle for power. In the 1990s, when the Kukis thought that they would have to fight against the army, they formed the Kuki National Organization and its own armed wing called the Kuki National Army. And since then, they have had multiple confrontations with the Indian Army, and many people have unfortunately lost their lives. Now, since the Kuki leaders have realized that it is not possible to have such a state that they are demanding, now their demand is that they want a separate independent district and not the state. This is the present demand. Just like we have the Bodoland Territorial Council under the 6th schedule, they also want to have the Kuki Land Territorial Council. Now, if you remember the 6th schedule, do remember Manipur is not a part of the 6th schedule. 6th schedule has 4 states, that is Assam, Tripura, Mizoram and Meghalaya, but not Manipur. So the government would need to pass special laws to make sure that Kuki land becomes a part of the 6th schedule. So the present stand is, number one, they want this independent district for themselves in the 6th schedule. Secondly, the Kukis have been saying that the government always, every single year since 2008, just keeps on extending our agreement, but they don't really come with a proper solution. In fact, the current central government also in September last year had just extended the agreement. The Kuki leaders think that the government of India is more focused on the Naga peace accord because the government thinks that they're under more danger of Nagas revolting against the state and they would want that to be resolved peacefully. But the Kukis want that their problem should be resolved first. The other conflict here is that the Naga peace accord that talks about forming Greater Nagaland or Greater Nagalim, they also want some areas of Manipur where Kukis are living. So the Kukis are not really trusting the central government. They want to see which of these two groups gets the area where the Kukis are inhabiting. The other problem, as we discussed earlier, is majority of the state's population is the Metis population, which have always been against the Kukis because they think that they are in the majority and they should decide how the state should run. The Kukis and their demand by the government should not be accepted and they should not be given any special power. It remains to be seen how exactly would the government fulfill this promise if they do after coming to power. Now, if you look at the geography of Manipur here, it's a very interesting state in the sense that it has a lot of diverse population. As we discussed, this is one of those states in the northeast that has a considerable amount of non-tribal population also living in the valley. But then the hills, especially the Churachandpur area, are dominated by the Kukis and they want a separate independent district for themselves. Also, because Manipur has a large international border that it shares with Myanmar, the Indian government has to be very careful in how the state is governed and the fact that there should not be any anti national sentiments in the state because it would lead to a lot of problems for the Indian government. Now, just a refresher on Manipur. If you look at the history of Manipur, it actually used to be a princely kingdom under Burma, that is today's Myanmar. It became a part of India officially in 1949 and was made a state only in 1972. The demand for statehood, however, was made very early on in the 1950s, but it was only in 1972 that it was actually formalized by the Indian government. This led to a rise of militancy within the state when the people started demanding that they should be given a state of their own. One of the problems that the government of India faces in a state like Manipur is who do they actually negotiate with? Within a small state, there are so many different groups that are formed. Even within the Kuki community, there are so many different groups formed. Everyone claiming that we are the ones who are the leaders of the Kuki community, that the government of India or the government of the state would not know with whom do they actually negotiate. And that has also led to many of these groups being heard by the government's response and being against the government. The other issue is while 9/10 of the state's area is in hills, but the population in these areas is very, very small. 1/10 of the state's area is in the valley, which has a majority of the population, that is a Meitei community. And the government has to ensure that the rights and the demands of both these communities have to be looked into and have to be respected. Over the past few years, we have also seen the politician and insurgent nexus in the state, where a lot of local politicians have taken up the sides of these insurgents and have been trying to be their representative while having talks with the government at the state and at the center. As we discussed, Manipur is a border state with Myanmar, which has historically allowed many insurgent groups from the northeast part of India to use their territory, which again remains a problem for India, which India has to look into. These are the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, highlight the need for reforms in India's justice system with a special emphasis on the condition of jails across the country. Second, despite multiple bold announcements, the fight against climate change seems to be a losing cause in India. Do you agree? Elaborate. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.